Okay, we're very fortunate at Interpol World Television to have Dr Mary Aiken, who is a cyberpsychologist. Mary, welcome to Interpol World Television.
Thank you.
What is cyberpsychology?
So cyberpsychology is the study of the impact of emerging technology and established technology on human behavior. My specialist area is forensic cyberpsychology, which is the study of criminal, deviant and abnormal behavior online. And unfortunately, I'm kept very busy.
Well, there seems to be increasing amounts of criminal and deviant activity online. Why do people think that they can behave differently in an internet or a cyber environment than they would do normally out in the real environment?
That's a good question. I mean, in cyberpsychology, we talk about constructs or drivers in terms of behavior online. And one is ODE, the online disinhibition effect, which is the work of Professor John Suler, 2004. And basically, the online disinhibition effect dictates that people will do things online that they will not do in the real world. Additionally, as a sort of sub-premise, you have the minimization and status of authority online. So effectively, the reason that we see cyber feral or cyber juvenile delinquency is often because there's a perception that nobody's in charge, because the reality is that nobody's in charge.
But do you think the time has come for the international community to recognize that the cyber environment is an environment where we need to get some form of international standards, international rules, not just to stop the lower level delinquency that's there, but also to import a rules-based system for state activity in the cyber environment?
Well, in 2016, NATO declared cyberspace as an environment, as a space. People like me, cyberpsychologists, we've been talking about cyberspace for the last 15 years. And effectively, NATO ratified cyberspace as an environment, declaring that the battles of the future, or acknowledging that battles of the future will be fought on land, sea, on air, and on computer networks. So I think once we start thinking about cyberspace as an environment, we have to think about cyber society and how we live in that environment. We have to consider the symbiotic relationship between the real world and cyberspace. What happens in the real world impacts on cyber. What happens in cyberspace impacts on the real world. And in addition to that, we have to layer in developmental aspects. Kids are being born, they're growing up in cyberspace, their behavior is being molded and informed. And in the real world, we've lots of interventions that we can stage. If we see a young kid going out and breaking a window, somebody's going to say that's not a good idea. If they set something on fire, then basically their local police officer might be called, they might get some sort of juvenile order. So there's all sorts of systems to actually cope with that juvenile delinquency. But in cyberspace, no. So we have a generation of virtual shoplifters, kids who've grown up pirating music, downloading free movies, although the IP belongs elsewhere, downloading crack software. So this mindset in terms of this is breaking the law, this is criminal behavior. And effectively, if that becomes a norm, then what's going to happen in a greater sort of societal context? So I think these discussions are worth having, talking about it, and factoring in here at the Interpol conference, we're talking about future policing. And when I gave my talk this morning, I was saying if we're going to talk about future policing, we have to look at future population, to look at how these kids are growing up, what their mindset is, what their moral compass is, and effectively what is criminal or not going forward. For example, this morning I was talking about sexting. So sexting at the moment, so that's self-generated indecent content or explicit content. So here's the problem, is that sexual curiosity in teenagers is normal behavior. And effectively, back in the day, people went behind the cowshed and played spin the bottle. But what they didn't do was take digital evidence and widely disseminate it. Now, because of the child pornography legislation, which is specific to child abuse material, effectively, if you take an image of yourself, if it is explicit, and if you are underage, you are de facto generating and distributing child pornography, albeit of yourself. So that's problematic. in terms of classifying this social behavior as being criminal. And when you look at the images themselves, like NECMEC, 10 years ago they were getting 10,000 images reported. Now they've got something like 100 million. So this is a big data problem. And if you take this sexted image and you take a child abuse material image, they can look very similar. But from a policing point of view, one is potentially a teenager being sexually curious, which is normal, and the other is a child who's a victim of a predator who's being groomed. But the images can look identical. So how do law enforcement then prioritize so that they can actually start looking at the high-risk victims, which is the child who might be groomed or being extorted or sextorted by an offender?
And again, the image that may have been innocently taken but breaks the law may be then found by someone who is a predator and therefore misused in a way that the individual hadn't intended. So extremely complex. But if you mentioned NATO declaring cyberspace as environment, NATO came up with the Talon and the Talon 2 protocols, but they haven't even got every NATO nation to sign up to them. If nations can't sign up to some form of rules-based system, what hope is there for us to get our youngsters to build it up from the bottom up? Is this something, the genie's out of the bottle, are we going to be able to put it back?
Yeah, I'm not somebody who believes the genie's out of the bottle. I think that, first of all, the internet was created on the premise that all users are equal. Well, this is not true. Some users are more vulnerable than others. Secondly, this sort of idealism around how we use the internet, how we use technology, for example, the premise of anonymity. So anonymity is a superpower of invisibility, but it comes with great responsibility. And when we look at all the downside of anonymity, which is like cyberbullying, trolling, cybercrime, identity theft, and then we look at the freedom afforded by anonymity, at some stage as a society, we have to ask the question about the greater good. So I can see a future where people are anonymous online, not anonymous, but they're anonymous, they're known. So for example, Tallinn in Estonia, they have a national identity card system. And that gets into the whole area of age verification. So you might have an identification system that just identifies you as 10-year-old male. And that might restrict the things that you can do online, and that would be a good thing, especially when it comes to looking at legal age inappropriate content, so hate speech. Well, hate speech is illegal in many territories, but say, for example, pornography or self-harm content or violent content.
Now, cybersecurity professionals aren't really dealing with this. When someone talks cybersecurity, they tend to talk networks and everything else. What you've been describing here the whole way through is the effects on humans, people at the front end who are causing the crime, people at the back end who are suffering from it. As a security industry, do we focus too much on technology and not enough on people?
We used to say that the problem with psychology was that for too long it had lived on a diet of white mice and college student surveys. The problem with technology is that for too long it's lived on a diet of data, devices and tech experts. So what we need to do is start factoring the human into the equation. If you look at criminology, effectively the one thing that separates humans is motive. So motive is something that is uniquely human. And effectively, if we can focus on motive, that will help us in terms of the behavioral profiling piece. So for example, something like insider threat. Insider threat is a complex entity because of the range of motives to engage in the behavior, which can range from doing it for revenge because you got passed over for a promotion, or some political idealism, or doing it for profit. So when you look at the range of motives, it becomes more complex in terms of profiling a specific criminal type of behavior.
Oh, in a past existence, I was involved in HUMINT, so if I want to get into a network, I will always use the human being, because you'll always find a motive somewhere.
That's what they say, weakest link in any secure system.
Exactly. But Interpol, we've got representatives from 194 different countries coming into Singapore. There are a large number who haven't been able to make it, who are going to be able to watch this online. If you had the ability to bang people's heads together to get one or two key messages out to them, what would they be and why?
I think the first thing is that from a policing point of view, we have to stop looking at things in silos. Human trafficking over here, cybercrime here, child-related sex offending over here, separating all of these areas into different silos because they're all connected. So that's the first thing, is we need to start joining the dots effectively. Secondly, in terms of the whole area of predictive policing, we need to start thinking about preventative policing. And that also means actually looking at constantly evolving human behavior, both actually looking at the human in terms of being a victim. If you look at the increasing sort of vulnerability surface, we're entering an age now with all our devices, all our content stored on it, all our cards on our devices. We're entering an era of ubiquitous victimology where we are all high-risk victims all the time. So from a policing point of view, that's problematic in terms of resource. So what I would say is that, you know, we've got to get a better sort of vision going forward of what's the landscape, what does it look like. Everything is connected. Society is changing at an individual level. It's changing at a group level. And as we have new innovations in technology, I think that at some point there has to be some consideration from a policing perspective of, well, what does this mean? What is the consequence of this? What does it really mean? Because otherwise, law enforcement are always just going to be reacting. And as I said in my talk this morning, there is a tsunami of criminality coming at us down the line, online. Because we're into an era of the complexity of the nature of the crime, of the sheer volume of criminal activity, of a generation coming along that doesn't have the same sort of restraints and constraints. So it's a sort of toxic cocktail. And I think that from a law enforcement perspective, that what needs to happen is a greater conversation, not at a policy level, law enforcement to government, but a greater conversation of law enforcement to general population, to society, saying, listen, we're police, we serve at the pleasure of the people, we're here to serve and protect. But look at the way things are going. How are we going to create a better cyber society? How are we going to create a better real world society? And what does society want of us as a police force? Because when you get into the realm of predictive policing, which might help deal with the complexity of some of the crimes, effectively what happens is people get very upset about the construct of surveillance. But here's the thing, we are all subject to the greatest level of surveillance known to mankind, and it's not coming from law enforcement. It's our governments. It's coming from social technology companies who have more data about us. Facebook could predict what color socks you're going to put on tomorrow, arguably. So I think that we need to have a conversation not led by police forces, but led by people who care about creating a better and safer cyber society.
No, I think the society issue is very interesting. People will very quickly complain about the police having facial recognition software and trialing it, but they'll still talk to Alexa or some other smart device in their house which is listening to them constantly and listening to everything that they are doing personally behind closed doors.
And they're hemorrhaging data. Hemorrhaging data, but because the construct is there, and there's far more regulation of a police force or a government entity than there is of any private industry. So it's a paradox. For me, it's a paradox.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on, Mary. It's been absolutely fascinating. I could talk to you all afternoon, but thank you very much indeed for giving up some of your time to come and talk to us on Interpol World Television.
Thank you. Okay.